story from September 5th talks about Myanmar's military junta being battered by Chinese-backed forces, whereas Reuters, in October, 1 month later, is talking about how China is actually holding up the junta, which should be a pretty clear indication that nobody has any idea what's going on here.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Murray, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of everything else is Robert Morris. How are you this week, Robert?
Oh, I'm doing all right. It's been obviously an interesting political week in the United States where this will be published, I think, the day before the big show. Fatigue set in a year ago. Now it's just, I think, a sense of exhaustion among really everybody in the United States.
Well, that's the joys of American elections. They never seem to end.
Until they finally do, long after everyone would like them to have.
So it still seems to be too close to call, despite certain Puerto Rican comments a comedian came out with, which I just find shocking.
Yeah, well, U.S. media will do everything it can to save the Republicans. So there's all manner of mini scandals that they're trying to float to provide balance with the Republican Party's scathing racism. One of the most interesting things about that Tony Hinchcliffe speech, this was in Madison Square Garden in New York City, was that honestly the Puerto Rican comment is making the most headway, but it was just filled with just racist blather and not particularly funny or intelligent. There's just nothing there but just sort of ugliness. And it's actually worth taking a look.
Well, people were pointing out there's no real, setup. It's really just, immigrants. Am I right? They're very quick to point out, we just like to make fun of everyone, but they never seem to make fun of, white cisgendered men.
Well, they're not, who was it? I think it was Chapo Trap House, went on great length about this. And they're just not very smart. There's not really any cleverness here. There's just racism and expecting to be celebrated for it. And I'm not saying about the Republican Party more generally, just a lot of these figures on the online sort of right-wing kick. But yeah, I mean, if you want to get pissed off, it's worth actually looking at more of the details from that speech, because it was apparently, I heard some clips that were, really bigoted against black people. Apparently there's some anti-Semitic parts, obviously deeply woman-hating throughout. It would be satisfying. I don't think it'll be entirely accurate, but it would be very satisfying if this prick went around for the rest of his life as the guy who cost Donald Trump the election. That'd be nice.
Wow.
That'd be nice.
Yeah. Well, he could join the Democrats at that point. They may make statues of him.
Oh, I don't think so. He's just.
I have some good news, Rob.
Oh yeah.
According to the Scottish Economist, if Trump does get in, everything should be okay for Ireland. So that's the main thing sorted.
Well, I think that's probably true, actually. It would be...
He's thinking that it's a lot about the nuts and bolts of economy. So it'll be kicking immigrants out and moving factories and stuff to America. And it's a bit since it's a lot of tech bros, they're just leave Ireland alone. We're happy to make our, tax savings there. So it might be good, but it's hard to know with Trump. He is unpredictable.
Well, the biggest threat to Ireland more generally is the United States getting sick of the way the tax things are structured. And one thing we know for sure is that the Republican Party has zero interest in screwing with the way that tax things are structured, other than to make them more free and easy. Whereas the Democrats actually care about things like budgets and deficits and justice. And I think there actually are elements and figures within the Democratic Party, people who were in the Biden administration, who've been talking more and more vocally about the kind of free ride that we've been giving Ireland, with all of these pharma and tech companies basically just doing tax arbitrage. And yeah, if Trump gets in, you won't hear anything about that for 4 years. So that's perhaps actually that would be, it's crap. I didn't want to give a reason to vote for Trump for Irish Americans right before the election, but I hope everyone will ignore that. Because who knows? There's also a chance that he could bomb Ireland. So who knows?
Well, speaking of a country America may be getting more interested in, but for all the wrong reasons, would you like to elaborate?
Yes. Today we're going to be returning to a discussion of Myanmar. We last visited Myanmar in January of 2024, where we gave a sort of fairly exhaustive, I was impressed with the amount of research we did, frankly, just sort of try to update or sort of
Overview.
Capsule history of Myanmar and how things are there. There have been some significant changes in the 8 months since, which we will talk about. But what's becoming what was sort of like a suspicion or a small worry for me in January of 2024 is becoming not quite panic, but like a real concern. It really seems like U.S. media and of course also U.S. government are like just chomping at the bit for a proxy war in Myanmar, and I think, as we illustrated in the last episode, this is kind of insane. So I've spent a couple days doing a little more research on Myanmar, and I'd like to be able to speak to the incredibly complicated situation in that country in a little bit more detail, and hopefully talk about a few of these articles and just how nuts it is, the way they're talking about this conflict and the way that they just see it as natural and good that the United States, from halfway around the world, should jump into the conflict with both feet, start supporting rebel armies, which we're already doing to an extent. And it just seems, I think the problem I have with it, Rory, is it reminds me so much of Syria, which is a conflict that I watched with first enthusiasm and then great horror and then incredible jadedness over the course of the 2010s. And I'm always sort of on the lookout for, okay, where's this next country with a legitimately bad dude in charge, Assad, legitimately a bad guy, where the United States is looking not to actually take out the bad guy, but actually to make money and chaos to an extent where it's actually worse than just leaving the dictator there. And I think Myanmar, though a very different place from Syria, 2 to 3 times the size, actually, and
with a bigger population as well.
Yeah. That was speaking popular. I'm always speaking in population terms.
Sorry.
I'm not very geographically minded. And I think that will absolutely come up as it came up in the first Myanmar episode. It's just really disturbing to see specifically U.S. media treat this the same way they were treating the Syrian conflict in 2011, essentially saying, and we're seeing this over and over, oh, the government is about to fall, the nasty dictatorship is about to fall, look at all the territory that the rebels are taking, and surely the dictatorship is on its last legs. This is what we heard in Syria in 2011, in 2012, through 2016, 5 solid years of, it's about to fall as the body count zoomed up into the hundreds of thousands. And we're just doing that exact same playbook here with even less basis in reality. I do think that there were moments when the Assad regime in Syria was legitimately shaky to some degree. They were brief. They were not sustained. I don't think that the regime in Myanmar is in any danger at all at this point. It's not winning. It's not having a good time, but it is not on the brink of collapse, the way everything from the New York Times to The Economist to Reuters to other U.S. news media outlets seem to be claiming. And it's really frustrating to see that because there's a clear agenda, which I think there's an Economist article that actually just came out right and said it, just at the end of the, it would be, talking about a variety of fantasies. It would also help shift the balance of power in Myanmar from China to the West, might present an opening for Western countries to play a bigger role in Myanmar, as if this is a good thing.
But why should the West be involved? Like, this is literally bordering China. It's in between India and China. It's as sort of un-West as you can really get. Like, it makes absolute sense. It's not in the Western Western Hemisphere, but also in the Western sphere. Like, it should be China's best friend. It's next door.
Well, and the thing is, it's not China's best friend. Like, China has no choice but to be involved in Myanmar, as we have no choice but to be involved in Mexico or Canada. And they're not, like, at all transparently supporters of the regime. They want a degree of stability and a degree of control over their borders and, whatever regional influence they can have over Myanmar. I would argue completely understandably. And they do that through supporting a range of groups, supporting the dictatorship, negotiating with that, also negotiating with the long-term resistance movements, many of whom are to some degree ethnically Chinese, though we're not going to parse those degrees.
It's a
today.
seems to be quite a small population of Chinese, but yes, they do seem to get attacked occasionally when these conflicts overspill, and then China, takes that incredibly seriously.
Well, no, but a lot of the ethnic resistance groups in Myanmar are Chinese, which is like kind of a key part of this conflict that gets underemphasized, including I think or maybe just 1 out of 3 of the Brotherhood Alliance, the largest and most successful of the groups, the
When you say
Army.
Chinese, would these be Chinese citizens that are maybe fed up with the Chinese regime and have moved to Myanmar, or is this like CCP backed?
So that's a longer term dynamic in the conflict. So I think at the end of the Chinese Civil War, there were Chinese nationalists that had lost to the communists and did take up long-term positions in Myanmar. But I think by this point, most of those populations have moved on to Taiwan because that's a much nicer place to go if you have a reason to be there.
It is.
But no, they are ethnicities that are, to some degree, I can't speak to this with any detail, are to some degree of Chinese extraction. Of course, what is Chinese, what have you, but there's linguistic affinity. It is very natural and not at all sinister that China would have some kind of influence in Myanmar. And it's not clear to me that they were that obstructive during the 10 years from 2011 to 2021, when Myanmar had a more openly U.S.-affiliated democracy-ish to work with. So yeah, the idea that we need to get into Myanmar to counter China, it's just like, why? Like, China just wants, hopefully, some kind of stability. And if I were a Burmese person, a person from Myanmar, as we addressed on the last episode, in all the reading, Myanmar and Burma are used so much interchangeably, and we're going to do that during this episode, or at least I'm going to do that during this episode, because
some countries still use Burma. But Myanmar seems to be the cool one now.
Yeah. But if I were from Myanmar, I would be a lot more concerned about the U.S.'s influence on this conflict with the U.S.'s track record than I would be about China, quite frankly. Because China is in the neighborhood, is interested in stability. The United States is only really interested in chaos, which, I mean, is perhaps a little unfair. We did support a democracy in 2011 in Myanmar, and then we kind of withdrew support because we didn't like what democracy meant in Myanmar, which to some extent it meant genocide, which is, of course, a controversial thing to say. But to review quickly, the key sort of starting point for what we're going to want to talk about today is February 1st, 2021, when that democratic government was overthrown by a military junta. Key thing to emphasize is that military junta, it's referred to as the Tatmadaw, which is the name of the Myanmar military. I've noticed a lot in my research over the past couple of days, a new acronym is coming in. People talk about the State Administrative Council, or the SAC. These are all sort of the same thing. The SAC, the Tatmadaw, and then, of course, they have a political party, the Union Solidarity Development Party, the USDP. That's all sort of the same thing. What's important to understand about the 10-year democratic period that ended in February 2021 is that the military was always in charge. It was always in control. What happened in 2011?
Yes, isn't it a unique part of Burmese politics? Is that it is sort of part of the government structure?
Oh well, that's not unique. I mean, that's like Turkey before Erdogan. That's like Egypt right now. That's like, it's certainly from the Western context. It's a little strange how directly, and that was a deal that was made in 2011. The negotiations when Aung San Suu Kyi, the Nobel Prize winning Democratic leader in Myanmar had been under house arrest for decades. When she was let out and able to form a government, the deal was that the sort of constitution or the governing agreement that was put together was that the military retains all of this power. And what happened was really, frankly, I think it's the NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi's government was too successful electorally, frankly. They won re-election in, I believe it's 2015 or 2016. And then in 2020, they won re-election in a landslide. The degree to which they won that election basically got the military, the Tatmadaw, nervous that they would have the ability to reconfigure this agreement that had stood since 2011. So they basically, threw over the card table and took over the country. Now, let me be very clear. This is a bad thing. This is a bad thing.
Yes. But also, I think just to get this into people's minds, famously, there was like a dance instructor doing like a video in front of a big, busy highway. And you can literally see the junta coming in behind and taking over the government. It's really surreal. So there's always just that. If you ever remember seeing that strange footage, it puts it in a time and place.
Thanks for mentioning it. That's a great clip, and it's definitely worth Googling, because I think it's probably one of the
task and purpose really got their use out of that clip.
Yeah. The YouTube channel, Chris made a big deal about it.
Yeah, the American military YouTube channel.
Yeah,
he joined in. He was in a dance rig out, joining her and talking about exactly what was happening.
Yes, I remember watching that in the video. I think that clip is probably like one of the, if you have like a pile of a couple dozen clips that represents a decade, I think that's probably going to be one of the ones from the 2020s.
Oh, definitely.
Just a fitness influencer with a coup destabilizing a country of 60 million behind her. But I think the answer that we want from the Tatmadaw and the SAC, Tatmadaw, SAC, same thing, from the military junta, is we want the military junta to go back to their barracks. We want them to give up and allow Aung San Suu Kyi and the government that won the election in 2020, we want them to come back to power. Hopefully with lesser powers for the military, but almost certainly with some guarantee of immunity and this, that, and the other thing for that military, so that we actually get a functioning-ish country again. I think one of the saddest things is that there was tremendous progress made during this decade of democracy. And I think what happened to some extent is that the Western backers got nervous and stopped backing this democracy as full-throatedly as they did because of the Rohingya genocide, which was a really sad, terrible thing that killed tens of thousands of Rohingya. Of course, the war that we've got going on right now and that the United States is now supporting is also killing thousands of Rohingya. So obviously peace was better than war. But on so many fronts, Myanmar was becoming a more unified, more stable country. And of course, that was in part what the Tatmadaw was rebelling against, because the whole reason that the Tatmadaw, this institution that has in different forms, more or less, been at the center of Burma's political development since independence in the late 1940s, its whole reason for existence is the fact that Burma is in a state of constant war. So what we really desperately need is reconciliation between the Democrats, the military government that still controls the vast majority of useful Myanmar. Instead, what the United States and the U.S. media is chomping at the bit for is for this ancient 80-year-old, multi-fronted, multifarious civil war to continue and accelerate. And what I don't think people are quite realizing is that by accelerating this civil war, you are actually creating more justification for the military junta. Because the military junta's whole justification, the reason it's been able to stay at the center of Burmese politics for 80 years, is because there's all these little insurgencies to fight. And the United States, in the name of democracy, is accelerating these insurgencies, which is kind of insane.
When it comes to armed groups, because I was reading that there are some that are, while some will be pro-Chinese, some are also pro-American. Could you tell me more about that, and why are they? Or is it just a CIA man turned up with a lot of cash and arms?
The extent to which they are like pro-American is, I think that's very hard to parse, or even that any of these ethnic groups that are supported by the Chinese are pro-Chinese. In an 80-year civil war, some of these groups, I mean, the groups themselves have gone through institutional changes, but we are talking about some of these groups with 30, 40, 50-year-old histories at this point. And they are groups, militias. In a lot of cases, they are independent governments with their own territories that pave the roads, that have, their own versions of West Points, military training schools. They see themselves to some extent as nation states and will work with whoever is providing them the best deal at this moment. So I don't think we can really characterize any actor in Myanmar as pro one side or the other, which of course makes it even crazier that the United States is choosing to get involved here. Like, nobody really cares about the conflict between the United States and China. All the United States can do here is make things dramatically worse. So the fundamental thing that U.S. media is doing that really pisses me off is I think they are, I don't know if they're doing this honestly or not, but functionally they are providing lies. They are providing a deep, deep distortion of what's actually happening here. There was an Economist article that had not the one I sent you, but the headline is, "The military dictatorship controls less than 50% of Myanmar." This is May 16th, 2024. It's a Reuters from October, Reuters title, "Insight: How an Anxious China is Backing Myanmar's Faltering Junta in Civil War," implying that it's about to fall. It's Myanmar's military junta is battered by Chinese-backed forces. That's interesting. These are both from October, by the way. So this is an Economist story from September 5th talks about Myanmar's military junta being battered by Chinese-backed forces, whereas Reuters is in October, 1 month later, is talking about how China is actually holding up the junta, which should be a pretty clear indication that nobody has any idea what's going on here. But what I object to, what bothers me so deeply, is this idea that the rebellions are winning.
Well, because I remember in one of the articles you sent me, they're talking about, is it the Rakhine province? They're basically like, oh, they control none of that. That's in its own whole wee orbit now.
Well, so that, yes, exactly. So what actually is the National Unity Government? What actually is the People's Defense Forces? What actually is, these broader issues? But the geographical issue, put simply, is just look at a population density map. I'm like a broken record with this. Anytime you start reading about a conflict, look at the population density map. This was during the conflict in Libya, the conflict in Yemen, the conflict in Syria. This was a tremendous failing by all the most serious U.S. media organizations, where they'd be like, look at how much land the rebels control, with never mentioning the fact that, or in Yemen's case, look how much land the internationally recognized government controls, where it turns out that the U.S. favored groups only control desert. Like there's actually not any people in all this incredible territory that they hold. And The Economist is doing that exact same thing here when they're talking about how the military dictatorship controls less than 50% of Myanmar. Sure, but nobody's doing this math, but I would expect that the military dictatorship still controls, 75 to 90% of the population of Myanmar. So Myanmar, briefly, is all of these ethnic groups. If you look at a map of Myanmar, there's all of these ethnic groups around sort of the sides, and importantly, on all of the borders that they have with all these countries, whereas in the middle, coming down to the ocean that is open to the entire world, you have the territory controlled by the Bamar majority. What has happened in 2021 that is significant is that within this Bamar majority, that is 60 to 70% of the population of Myanmar, there is a very serious rift. Aung San Suu Kyi, I believe, is Bamar. I believe most of her government is Bamar. The Tatmadaw is mostly Bamar. This is like the majority of Burma, and it is this Bamar population that has fought is, primarily who all of the ethnic militias have been fighting against for 80 years. There is the National Unity Government, which I do believe is vastly more legitimate than any actor the United States supported in Syria. It is the remnants of the democratic government that was kicked out in February of 2021. These are the people who should be in power in Burma. These are the people who won the election. They have this thing called the People's Defense Forces, which is something between a serious resistance guerrilla movement and a complete mirage. I've been looking at this for 2 days, and I couldn't tell you which one of those it is. What is clear is that it is a sort of veneer of internationally respectable, unified rebel movement on top of what's actually happening, which is a collection of ethnic militias using this discontent with the traditional Bamar majority to dramatically expand the territory that they control. So we're nominally funding these kinds of actors, and the National Unity Government and the People's Defense Forces, the military wing of the National Unity Government, definitely gets funding from the United States, which is distributed in some fashion that I do not understand. And I'm pretty sure USAID, the U.S. agency distributing that funding, probably doesn't fully understand either, in such a way as to accelerate the destruction of Burma, the ripping apart of the country, not to actually put this democratic government back in power. And I get why the National Unity Government would want to do this. They have been militarily, violently kicked out of power. They belong legitimately in power. And all across the country's borders, there are heavily armed actors that have the power and interest to fight against the military junta that is briefly an enemy of both democracy and all these little ethnicities. And it's just such a bad idea. And you can watch the country get further and further ripped apart. So for about 2 years, from 2021 until 2023, there was certainly a war, certainly a horrific repression of the supporters of democracy on the streets of the main cities of Burma. But there wasn't a ton of serious conflict where territory is being taken. What set the U.S. And Western media into a tizzy is of great affection for the ethnic separatists in Burma is the 1027 offensive, which we talked about last time. And that is when the Three Brotherhood Alliance, the Arakan Army, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army, and the TNLA, which I think that's the Tang National Liberation Army, what have you. A coalition of 3 of these forces got together and decided in October 27th of 2023, to essentially unleash hell on the military government. And they made a lot of headway. And in January, we recorded, and I think I have to correct myself a bit, because I do think I underestimated what this grouping was actually capable of. I didn't think they'd ever be able to take any serious population centers, but in August of 2024, they did. They took, and I believe they continue to hold, the town of Lashio, which is in Shan province. Now, if you look at your population density map and Shan province and Lashio, this is, again, not where many people live, but this was the military command post for the northern Shan province, for the junta. This was a place where this was not a sort of at the hinterlands of Myanmar. This was a flourishing town of over 100,000 people. I've seen conflicting reports of what the population was. Voice of America said it was 250,000. Maybe that's because a lot of refugees went there because of other fighting, because that seems to be higher. It seems in 2019 it was 100,000. Regardless, it's now apparently down to like 20,000. It's been almost completely depopulated because of the months of fighting. Then, of course, the military junta's horrific bombing campaign. It's Voice of America, so they're going to be blaming the junta's horrific bombing campaign more than they're going to be blaming the fact that the rebels decided to take this modern city. I think one of the things that really got to me the most was one of the people they were interviewing who had fled from Lazio in this article was like a online sales rep or something like that. I perhaps this is a kind of like I'm sure this is a kind of bigotry on my part, but when I associate like war zones and like like it's like, oh gosh, the peasants are running or this, that, the other thing, and I think it is the case with a lot of the territory that has been fought over hitherto. It's a lot of impoverished people dealing with very old school problems of folks who are tied to the land, who dealing with combating armies. It's a horrific story, tale as old as time. But like an online sales rep, like this is a woman who inhabits the exact same milieu that we inhabit, that I could have dated or something like that.
The world is changing and the internet is everywhere. So it would, just because you're maybe online and selling things that way doesn't mean you can't get caught up in a revolution / your country's falling apart.
Of course, and we saw this over and over again in Syria specifically as like beautiful, really pleasant, mostly middle-class places to visit got ripped to hell by U.S.-sponsored forces. And I'm just saying that, like, in Myanmar, where perhaps there wasn't so much of that, we're now seeing more of that. And to be clear, like, the middle-class folks who live lifestyles like we do here in the West are concentrated in the Bamar central places that the junta controls, and the junta has been doing horrifically evil stuff to protesters there and being very repressive. But it's just, to see like a town of 120, 200,000 people just sort of emptied out, and then to see all of U.S. media be like, woo-hoo-hoo, yippee, success, is a bit disturbing. Lazio is, I think, the 10th or 11th largest population center in Burma. And this is a country with like not a lot of population centers. It is 200 kilometers from Mandalay, which is like a top 5 city in Burma. This is closing in on the junta, but it's like saying like a 50-year-old is closing in on death in their 80s or something. Like it is definitely a bad thing for the junta. But it is, I would say, worse for the people of Lazio and worse for the long-term viability of the Burmese state than it is for the junta. I've been thinking a lot about like just this sort of ethnic nightmare feedback loop that we could see. I don't think we've quite seen it in Lazio yet. But what if the Three Brotherhood Alliance does take Mandalay, which I understand to be one of the largest cities in the country, majority Bamar, I believe.
Yeah, it's 1.2 million people, second largest city.
Huge city. What happens if this... so apparently one element of the Three Brotherhood Alliance, the TNLA, is actually pretty well known for being ethnically supremacist in the territories they take. What if they decide that for their suffering and...
Because I think isn't that the main issue with this is there's fighting going on sort of in a lot of these provinces, but they kind of all hate each other, but it's like it's fair game to attack the government essentially. So everyone hates the government, and even if they do overthrow the government, it'll just be, well, now let's fight each other.
Yep. Everybody hates the government, and everybody sees the opportunity to improve their positions to eventually fight against each other. One of the dynamics that I wanted to research more is that one of the great things that happened during the Aung San Suu Kyi government and also before was that these ethnic armies would be sort of incorporated into the government in a certain way. They would be made, I think it's BRGs, or there's some border-related acronym. They would become sort of border forces, nominally working with the central military junta and government. And that was like, a way to sort of start them on a procedure towards regularization. The number of those forces that are now fighting against the government and fighting against each other is a little terrifying. And all of these Like, so my fear is that what happens when one of these groups or a combination of these groups, like the Three Brotherhood Alliance, takes over a Bamar majority population of great size and just decides it's time for some reprisals. It's time to do some of the things to them that have been done to them over decades. Then what I think you would see under the 68% of the population that is Bamar is a whole bunch of people running towards the military junta to protect them, even though at this moment they might be somewhat disenchanted. I listened to a fascinating episode of a podcast called Insight Myanmar. I think that they are I would probably disagree with their interpretation on this conflict in some ways. I think they're probably a little bit more excited about the prospect of the junta just falling and disappearing.
Do they actually live in Myanmar, or are they like expats just talking about what it was like there?
I believe they're expats, but they had a great panel discussion with a whole wide variety of folks, U.S. government folks. There was an ambassador, there was a lobbyist, and it was kind of fascinating because the host was sort of like, oh, and what's going to happen when the junta falls? And it was kind of fascinating how everybody who had any exposure to this was like, this isn't actually, that's the junta's not going to fall. And there's a real disconnect between how experts talk about this and there's no, and their end game and the way that U.S. media is talking about this and like the possibility of the junta falling. But one of the things, I think it was a lobbyist of some sort who was a little more deluded on this. And honestly, I mean, I think he was the closest to a local, on this panel, and I should defer to that. But it was interesting. He was talking about how, well, the Tatmadaw, the military junta, couldn't possibly make the case that they are there to defend the Bamar majority anymore because of all of the horrible repression they've done of protests and all of the brutalization and all of the people in prisons. Well, I'm here to tell you, from my experience watching the Syrian civil war, that is not the case. Not just, every religious minority in Syria, most of the Christians, the Armenians, certainly the Alawites, but actually a lot of Sunni majority folks who were supposedly represented by the Syrian rebellion, they were all probably revolution curious in 2011, but by the end of 2012, it didn't matter. And Assad, to be clear, long before, much like the Tatmadaw, was just insanely brutal. The Assad regime is gross. They've got horrible prisons with piles of corpses. But the Sunni majority that was not like a deranged, was not into very hardcore radical Islam, and the majority of the Syrian population, it strikes me, has pretty much been like, well, if it's between Assad and violent chaos, we're going to go with Assad. And I fear that with these successes like Lashio, the national resistance in Myanmar is getting closer and closer to that breaking point where the Bamar majority goes, you know what, I'd really much rather have a democracy, but I really don't want to have my city overrun by the Arakan army. So I guess we're gonna go with the Tatmadaw.
If you were to put your blob hat on, what would your ideal situation be? Or what would you think would happen if you were in the blob? What would you want to unfold here?
Well, I think the blob is confused, but that doesn't stop them because they don't understand what's going on here. I don't think this is malicious. I think they just don't really get it. I think there are, as there are in all heroic resistance movements, there are people in Myanmar who are invested in keeping the blob from understanding what's going on. Like this, I mentioned the People's Defense Forces, the military wing of the Democrats that had gotten kicked out. Like, I have no idea what it is. Is it a guerrilla movement? Is it a myth? They are taking things in partnership with this ethnic army. It's impossible to read this reporting and have any idea what's going on if you're in the blob.
So the blob is shorthand for the Pentagon for anyone listening, and they're confused.
Or the U.S. intelligence community. What's interesting, actually, at this point is that the Pentagon, thankfully, isn't in this heavily quite yet. But the USAID, The State Department is doing this. And, they're supposedly the folks who really know what's going on and the clever part of the U.S. government. But I think there's just not a lot of critical thought about disasters we've helped create in the past and the disaster that we're helping right now. So I think honestly, the instinct of the State Department, of the blob, of the deep state, what have you, is just to be involved because we're America and we should be involved everywhere. And there's a clear bad guy. It sounds simplistic, but this was what I saw in Syria for a decade, was all that we wanted was to be involved, to have a situation that could plausibly lead to weapons sales at some point, as Syria absolutely did. We ended up bombing our proxies, the Islamic State. But the way that people actually think is, look, there's this evil, and the Myanmar military junta is indisputably evil, as is the Assad regime in Syria. Let's just go after it. Let's just find a way to screw things up because anybody who's fighting the evil must be good. We found out that the jihadists that became the Islamic State in Syria were not, in fact, good, and regretted supporting them. It's impossible to characterize the resistance in Myanmar as any one thing, as really the resistance in Syria mostly became the Islamic State. And then, of course, the good guys, the moderate opposition, Al-Qaeda.
I think it's just hard for one group to take over because it's very difficult terrain. We're dealing with mountains, we're dealing with the Himalayas, we're dealing with jungle. It's much harder for one group to sort of overtake the Islamic State did. I think we're just going to see a lot of terrifying groups in charge of their provinces, and they just mightn't agree with each other for a very long time, tragically.
Yeah, I mean, and some of these groups, even outside of the National Unity Government, are indisputably in the right. They are to some extent, living out in these provinces. The approved acronym now even in U.S. legislation is, I believe, ethnic armed organizations. So the NUG, the people who should be in control in Myanmar, justified folks.
The woke name for terrorist groups, is it?
I mean, terrorist groups is not the. I wouldn't use terrorist group for the resistance movements and some mini states. But the NUG and the PDF, whatever it is, exist at the sufferance of these ethnic armed organizations. And the ethnic armed organizations, some of them legitimately do want just a federalized state with autonomy, which I think is the reasonable goal for these groups. But some of them want independence. Some of them want independence, and they also want the territory of the ethnic armed organization that's right next to them. The grimmest example has got to be, so what's happening with Lashio, that's the biggest, I believe, single population center that has been taken. That's a big deal in Shan State. But that's a weird coalition of three groups, and how they're going to continue to work with each other or not is somewhat open. One of the members of the Three Brotherhood Alliance, the Arakan Army, is on the other side of the country in Rakhine State, has been, I'd say, indisputably not indisputably, but individually the most successful group fighting against the junta. And the Rakhine State is legitimately famous, was the first state name I knew in Myanmar because of the Rohingya genocide. This is the group of, for lack of a better term, more subcontinental Indian-looking folks who are Muslim, who have been horrifically targeted by the military junta and other elements. Among the other elements that have been horrifically targeting the Rohingya are the Arakan Army that is currently taking over Rakhine State. So it looks like in 2024, we are now attaining the horrific heights of the Rohingya genocide of 2016-2017, except it is the Arakan Army that is apparently doing the genociding, and the junta is apparently forcefully conscripting the Rohingya into the junta's army. So it's just incredibly dark, and this is the crucial two-step that I know very well from Syria. I am 100% sure. Well, I'm not 100% sure actually, that not a dime of U.S. money is going directly to the Arakan Army for exactly these human rights issues. But are there other elements within Rakhine State that are ethnically armed organizations that are against the junta, that are receiving humanitarian assistance, food, governance assistance, what have you. Absolutely. I mean, this is the two-step we do in Idlib. No, we're not funding Al-Qaeda in Idlib, Syria. We're funding the local governments that do everything so Al-Qaeda, under Al-Qaeda, so Al-Qaeda can focus on fighting the Syrian army. Yes, of course, the United States would never fund such an organization as the Arakan Army, but we're funding their allies. We are funding the elements of the NUG or the PDF that are, or maybe we're not funding the NUG and the PDF directly, but we are funding civil society in the geographical regions that these folks control. So essentially, we are funding these groups, just like we were funding the Islamic State, even though we weren't like writing a check saying like, here's money to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. We were funding weapons. We are not yet funding weapons. That is a key distinction. So what I did not talk about, what I was embarrassingly was not aware of in our January episode on Myanmar, is this thing called the Burma Act. At Absolute, the U.S. government, the U.S. Congress's passion for absurd acronyms is often mind-blowing. It is... So it's the Burma Act. The U.S. government is probably the largest institution that still refers to Myanmar as Burma. But the Burma Act isn't just saying Burma Act. It's an acronym. It's the Burma United for Rigorous Military Accountability Act. Burma.
Rigorous accountability.
Rigorous military accountability. So this act was passed in December 2022 as part of a NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, which is a lot of things get attached to the National Defense Authorization Act because it's one of two bills that has to be passed every year to keep the U.S. military going. So a lot of stuff gets thrown in there. And at this point, the aid from the Burma Act is non-lethal. We are not paying for weapons yet. The Pentagon has not yet jumped in here. But this is how these things start.
But that can still include like uniforms and helmets and things like that, so things that would be useful for a military.
It can definitely include transport. It can include like jeeps and fuel and this, that, and the other thing. And
or minesweepers, things like that.
Well, this is a dance we did in Ukraine for most of the Obama administration until Trump took, not most of the Obama administration,
stepped it up
from 2014 until 2017, until Trump took the governor off and started giving Ukraine tons of weapons. And yeah, so it is not reassuring, Rory, to hear that we're only doing non-lethal assistance. So I think the goal here is to get the National Unity Government, or the NLD, I think is the party that they were when they were in government before the coup in 2021, to get them back in power, get them negotiating with the junta, and get them negotiating with all these ethnic armed organizations. What we are doing, that the Burma Act explicitly allows us to do, is funnel funding to the ethnic armed organizations, which will lead to, I believe, in the longer term, more division in Burma, which provides more rationale for this nasty military junta we don't like. We should be funding diplomacy in Myanmar. We should be looking for ways to have conversations. We should not be feeding and clothing the ethnic armed organizations that can then use that money to go buy weapons to further divide Burma. But that's sort of what we're doing here.
What's India thinking of all this?
I didn't. That is not an aspect I was able to get into.
Okay, because the fact is, theoretically, India might be a threat in the future if China starts to decline, and Myanmar gives you the option to interfere with both at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. But and even in that Machiavellian conception, if the this is why the Taliban is vastly more useful to the United States, should we choose to pick up that weapon, than the absurd government we dumped tens of billions of dollars into over 20 years in Afghanistan. How much more useful would Burma be as leverage against China or India if it were a unified, strong, peaceful, prosperous state than this just sort of chaos dump? And unfortunately, we are contributing to chaos dump. Just one thing I want to say about something that I don't think we emphasized enough in the last episode was these ethnic armed organizations fight each other. It's a little, the biggest winner, I think what is seen as the biggest ethnic armed organization is called the UWSA. It is the WA Army. And it's interesting because in all of these Economist articles, the Reuters articles, all of the celebration of the progress of the resistance, of the rebellion in Myanmar, you never hear any mention of the WA Army, of the biggest ethnic armed organization that is broadly conceded among...
United Wa State Army?
Yes, United Wa State Army. You never hear mention of it because it's pretty strongly affiliated with the military junta and is seen as kind of the big winner.
And China, apparently.
And China. And is kind of seen as the big winner in the Shan state that is currently seeing the biggest successes of the Free Brotherhood Alliance. So it's a fiendishly complex conflict that is certainly moving in horrifying directions, becoming more violent, causing more deaths, causing more displacement. But I wouldn't be so confident as most U.S. media to insist that as things get worse, the military junta is going to get less popular. In fact, I think that as things get worse, which we in the United States are funding and hoping for, the military junta might get more popular. And I think that's a sort of...
Oh, definitely.
Exactly what we don't want to happen kind of situation that I wish more people were thinking about and talking about, which is what we've attempted to do today.
So please stay out of Burma, America, and encourage peace as much as you can.
Indeed. Well put.
So here's hoping.
Yes.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.